Vietnam 1966. Yesterday on August 17th, the enemy sent mortar and recoilless rifle teams within attack range of about 2 kilometers from your base. The surprise bombing that has lasted throughout the night has killed at least one soldier and wounded several others. Thankfully, further enemy attacks are halted by the rapid counterfire from the base's guns into the jungle brush. The next morning, the commander of the base orders Delta Company to locate the enemy and their firing positions and clear the area. Instead, they will run into an enemy ambush and fight an intense battle over the next 24 hours against a vastly larger number of the Viet Cong. This is the story of the ambush at Long Tang. Australia was one of the few countries that contributed to the United States in the Vietnam War effort from 1962 to 1971. But due to diplomatic considerations, the Australian government wanted to restrict their forces to southern coastal areas and prevent deployment anywhere near international borders. The overall command of forces in Vietnam was under the American General Westmoreland, who agreed with the Australian request and was eager to make good use of the Australian troops in the area east of Saigon, a mostly Viet Cong-controlled farming province called Phuoc Tuy. The first complete Australian Army unit deployed to Vietnam was the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, or 1st RAR, in April 1965. This unit was initially sent to Bien Hoa outside of Saigon, joining the American 173rd Airborne Brigade. The following month, the Australian unit received a battery of 155mm guns, augmenting the other battery of 105mm from New Zealand, and a squadron of M113 armored personnel carriers. The following year, in March of 1966, the 1st RAR returned home, replaced instead by the 5th RAR and the 6th RAR, which came a month after. These combined units were then designated the 1st Australian Task Force, or ATF, which would start operating independently. The ATF was then sent to Vung Tau in May 1966. Let's take a look at the local area of operations for some context. The province of Phuoc Tuy was mostly a rural area made up of farm fields and scrublands, though there is also some jungle areas. Most of the 100,000 inhabitants of this province lived along the coastline areas and were known to be pro-Viet Cong or at least neutral, making the task of pacification more challenging and dangerous for the Australian forces. To the northeast of Vung Tau, in the Mai Tau Hills, the Viet Cong's 5th Division was deployed, while a smaller detachment, the locally raised guerrilla D445 VC Battalion, was known to be spread out within the various local villages. The ATF commander, Brigadier O.D. Jackson, decided to set up a forward base of operations at a small hill known as Nui Dat, 20 miles north of the base at Vung Tau. Here he placed his 105mm artillery along with a unit of American-made 155mm guns, which could cover a wider area. And so on May 24th, the 5th RAR joined the American 173rd Airborne Brigade to secure Nui Dat Hill and surrounding areas from the Viet Cong. 3 weeks later, the 6th RAR would be joining the other Aussie units, allowing the Americans to pull out the 173rd Airborne Brigade to be redeployed elsewhere. The Australian soldiers were now on their own to control and pacify the entire province. The Australians deployed their Special Air Service, or SAS, units to push deep into the province in search and destroy missions, often ambushing the Viet Cong troop movements using claymore mines and machine guns. The 5th RAR and the 6th RAR were ordered to clear a buffer zone around the Nui Dat Hill base to keep the Viet Cong beyond mortar range. Villages in the area, including Long Tan, were searched and their inhabitants relocated to other areas in order to maintain security in the sector around the base. However, on August 17, 1966, the Viet Cong was able to bring mortar teams within range of the base and caught the Australians by surprise with a barrage of fire, killing 1 Aussie soldier and wounding 23 others. The Australian commander then ordered the 5th RAR and A Company of the 6th RAR on a search and destroy mission of the enemy mortar teams. Brigadier Jackson then sent out the understrength Bravo Company 6th RAR to sweep the area east of the base. Finding no enemy, the Australian units were ordered to return to base by the following day, when Delta Company 6th RAR would then take over the patrols. Unknown to the Australians, the Viet Cong had amassed 7 battalions of over 4,000 men in total strength and were closing in on the Nui Dat base. 3 battalions would swing towards the north to flank the base, while the other 4 battalions would advance from the east using the Long Tang rubber plantation as cover. The following day, August 18, 1966, Delta Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, commanded by Major Harry Smith, prepared to set out to locate the enemy mortar positions that had fired on their base, as well as to track the enemy routes of retreat and push the enemy back beyond mortar range. Delta Company was made up of 108 men split into 3 platoons, the 10th, 11th, and 12th, with a small HQ detachment. At 1100 hours on August 18th, they left the Nui Dat base with 2nd Lieutenant David Sabin's 12th Platoon on point. 2 hours later, Delta Company linked up with Bravo Company just west of the rubber plantation. The 6th RAR continued east into the plantation itself, where the trail then splits to the north and east into the evenly spaced rubber trees. 2nd Lieutenant Jeff Kendall's 10th Platoon takes the northern trail route, while 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp's 11th Platoon moves east into the rubber tree area. The 12th Platoon and the HQ detachment follow closely behind Sharp's 11th Platoon. 40 minutes later, the leading 11th Platoon encounters a half a dozen Viet Cong soldiers and fires upon them. Some of the VCs escape east into the wall of dense jungle. As the 11th Platoon enters the jungle in pursuit of the enemy, the area erupts in an intense hail of fire from the hidden Viet Cong soldiers, killing 2 Australians instantly and sending the rest of the platoon to seek whatever cover they can find. The Viet Cong battalion's attack intensifies as the enemy forces attempt to encircle the trapped 11th Platoon. Farther behind, the 12th Platoon and the HQ detachment are attacked with mortar fire and cannot advance to rescue the 11th Platoon. The well-trained and disciplined Australians recover from the initial shock of the ambush and begin to return effective fire, picking off enemy soldiers while remaining in cover. Captain Maurice Stanley, a forward observer with the HQ detachment, begins to call in artillery strikes, and soon the shells of all 24 of the Aussies' 105mm guns are exploding all around the Viet Cong's positions. The Americans' 155mm guns also join in and pulverize the whole area of the rubber plantation. Within minutes, as the 10th Platoon is making its way south along the trail to reinforce the beleaguered troops of the 11th and 12th Platoons, the weather turns bad with torrential rains, and visibility is then reduced to less than 50 yards. Meanwhile, back at the base at Nui Dat, Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend, commanding the 6th RAR, decides to send out a relief force consisting of Alpha Company 6th RAR on board the M113 armored personnel carriers. Leaves the base compound at 17:45 hours. At the rubber plantation, Delta Company is putting up a good fight, but they are beginning to run low on ammunition. Sections of the 11th Platoon pull back towards the HQ group in the west and set up a defensive perimeter while the wounded are tended to. The artillery barrage suddenly ceases to allow 2 Australian UH-1 helicopters from Nui Dat to bring in much-needed supplies. At that point, the Viet Cong begins a human wave attack on the Australian defending force, which is stopped in time when the artillery barrage starts again, breaking off the enemy assault. The Viet Cong, determined to destroy the Australians, sends the D445 battalion around to the west to complete the encirclement. At that moment, Robert's M113 armored personnel carriers cross the Sui Da Bang River and completely surprises the VC battalion. The M113s fire their .50 caliber machine guns at near point-blank range, and some M113s even run over other VC soldiers trying to escape. The M113s have arrived at the Australian defensive perimeter at 1840 hours and begin to push back the enemy with intense fire. A few minutes later, Bravo Company 6 RAR, which has moved east from Nui Dat on foot, arrive and provides additional reinforcements. With this now larger force, the Australians begin to pull back west, while additional supplies are brought in from the base. The following morning, on August 19, 1966, Townsend orders Delta Company 6 RAR to reoccupy the battlefield. Amazingly, they are able to find 2 wounded Australians while recovering the bodies of their fallen brothers. They also collect the enemy dead and bury them. The Australians have lost 17 men killed, while they have counted 245 enemies dead. This ambush has actually turned into a victory for the Australians, who have crushed the attackers through their superior firepower of the artillery batteries, the M113 armored personnel carriers, and the well-trained infantry soldiers. The Australians have managed to push the VC 5th Division back into the Mai Tao Hills while extending control of more territory in the province. The Australians withdrew all their combat forces from Vietnam in late 1971, having suffered 423 men killed and 2,398 wounded. After they left the Phuoc Tuy province, the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, were unable to maintain control, and the VC eventually would take over the villages and territories that had been held for so long by the Australians. If you enjoyed watching this episode, go ahead and hit the like button and leave a comment. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel. That way you get notifications of the next videos. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.